Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Today, we're exploring the US-Japan alliance amid rising strategic competition with China. Japan has been touted in recent weeks as a potential new partner in the AUKUS security arrangement between the US, UK, and Australia. With Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's visit to Washington last week, the seas might be shifting in the Indo-Pacific. For more on this topic, we speak with Yuki Tatsumi, director of the Stimson Center's Japan program, who has decades of experience providing insights on the Indo-Pacific and Japanese foreign policy. But before we get into that, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
So, Freddie, what do we have on the docket today?
So first, we're going to be talking about Iran's strikes against Israel over the weekend and how that might feed into a feared regional conflict in the wider Middle East. Next, we're going to talk about the fallout of a raid by the Ecuadorian security forces on the Mexican embassy in that country. For the last item, we're going to get into the recent Turkish municipal elections that handed President Erdogan his biggest electoral defeat in recent memory. Finally, we're going to turn to our conversation with Yuki Tatsumi about the recent upward trend of the US-Japan alliance and what that might look like going forward in light of the recent summit last week. So we're going to start off with the most pressing piece of news, that is the Iranian response to the Israeli strike on the Iranian diplomatic compound in Syria. Iran launched a massive wave of drones and missiles targeting a number of military sites in Israel, nearly all of which were shot down. Besides one minor damage to a military facility and one civilian injury, the attack seems to have been a failure. It was the first direct strike from Iranian territory towards Israeli territory and was therefore a major escalation in the long-running proxy conflict, until now proxy conflict, between the two countries. Allies like the United States have rallied around Israel and pledged to defend it, but are simultaneously urging restraint in hopes of avoiding any climbing of the ladder of escalation between the two powers. So, Kelly, let's first dissect what happened on Saturday night and how it came about. Why did Iran launch these strikes?
So, we got to start on April 1st. And on April 1st, the Israelis launched an airstrike on the Iranian diplomatic outpost in Syria, which killed 7 Iranian soldiers, including a senior military commander. So that was basically a strike to take out this senior military commander of the Iranians. So Iran has been saying since then that it was going to respond, that it felt that it needed to respond. And as you pointed out, the fear amongst people was that we were just going to keep moving up the escalation ladder here, that Iran would respond and then Israel would have to respond harder and then Iran would respond again. What happened is that Iran was saying they were going to respond. It looks like they reached out to a lot of people to tell them that they were going to respond. And they launched a series of missiles and drone attacks at Israel on Saturday night. 99% of those, according to the IDF, were taken out. There was light damage at a military installation and 1 injury, so almost non-existent as far as casualties go on the Israeli side. And what was interesting about this was that it's been reported that the U.S. shot down one of these drones, the Jordanians shot down some of these drones. So there was, partners in the region, and the fact that the Jordanians came to the aid of the Israelis to knock something out of the air was pretty unique if you know the history of the region and what's gone on there. Moving forward, it's going to be interesting because there are debates going on in Israel on whether or not they should respond to Iran's response to the initial attack of the Israelis. Western leaders, President Biden, other European leaders have reiterated America's commitment to Israel, but also have, been saying, this is kind of a win. You shot down all of these things that were shot at you from Iran. Let's just kind of move forward now and stop the risk of escalation. There are some on the right wing in Israel that are pushing for a response to this, especially due to the fact that this is the first time that an attack on Israel has been launched from Iranian soil and not by one of their more close by proxies. We'll see where this goes from here. But if we can get through this and there isn't an Israeli response, I think that will, for the moment, at least tamp down any potential for this war widening. I think this is one of the most dangerous moments of the past 6 months since the Gaza war began, where something like that could happen. But hopefully we can get through this.
So now let's turn to the raid on the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. So earlier this month, authorities in Ecuador raided the Mexican embassy to arrest the country's former vice president, who had been wanted on a number of corruption charges. Up until then, he had been sheltering at the embassy and had just been granted political asylum in Mexico before the incursion. The move infuriated Mexico, which severed diplomatic relations with Ecuador immediately and prompted swift condemnation around the world. It's the latest of strongman President Daniel Noboa's moves to ostensibly crack down on crime and corruption in the country, but some see it as a move by the president to look strong ahead of next year's elections. Kelly, what's going on in Ecuador, and how unusual is the embassy raid in the context of diplomatic history and custom in this area?
Yeah, so this is a weird one. This isn't something that happens every day. Countries normally don't go into other countries' diplomatic facilities and yank people out and put them under arrest. As you mentioned, former Vice President Glass had claimed political asylum in Mexico, and that had been granted by the Mexican government. So at that point, basically, he becomes off limits to the Ecuadorians due to international law, specifically the 1961 Vienna Convention. So, this isn't something that countries do. And to put it in perspective, and to make it even more ironic, is that our favorite WikiLeaks head, Julian Assange, was actually hiding out in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for about 6 years because the Ecuadorians had given him asylum. You never saw the Brits or the Americans run into that facility to grab him and arrest him because they were respecting international law. So this, in many ways, this speaks more to internal politics in many ways in Ecuador than it does to any sort of Ecuadorian-Mexican relations, which are pretty good on the whole. Noboa, as you pointed out, has been very tough on crime, and that's kind of been his political line since he came to power, and he's doing a lot to crack down on drug crime, gang crime in Ecuador. And it hasn't necessarily been going the way that he had hoped since he's been in power. So a lot of this has to do with domestic politics and him sort of, saying we're going to go in and we're going to get this guy. And, this is a big thing for our domestic crackdown on crime because he's corrupt. It's his way to kind of show his people that this campaign against crime is still ongoing, trying to cement his public image as a strong man on crime. I see it mostly as a domestic political issue, but they are getting some major international backlash from regional countries and partners in the US and others. So we'll see how this plays out. But as of this recording, former Vice President Glass still remains in an Ecuadorian jail.
So for our final story today, we're going to go to Turkey, where the party of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan recently lost in a big way in local elections held at the end of March. It was a bounce-back performance for the opposition CHP party that went against polling predictions and lost last year's presidential election, which was seen at the best chance of ending Erdogan's 20-year grip on Turkish politics. The CHP scored major victories across the board, taking mayorships in the biggest city, Istanbul, and the capital, Ankara, while winning the biggest plurality of the popular vote since 1977. Kelly, all of this sounds like opponents of Erdogan are on the rise electorally in Turkey, but what effects might this have down the road?
Well, this was an interesting result, and as you noted, wasn't good for Erdogan and something he wasn't necessarily expecting, especially after winning the presidential election in 2023 handily. But I think this does speak to the domestic pushback against Erdogan at this point. He's been, as you said, in power for over 20 years. He's pushed past constitutional limits, things like that, rewritten the Constitution to make certain positions stronger than they were, to make his position stronger than it was. It remains to be seen what's going to happen in the long term. But I think as far as the CHP is concerned, I think this has to sit well with them because they just won and did win these big cities and expand their hold over them. But also I think the timing is right because we're starting to get to the point where one would think, at least, we're going to have to start to see a search for a potential successor to Erdogan who might not have just the name recognition, the backing that Erdogan has had or has after being in power for 20 years. So they're doing this at the right time. And I also think it's a bit of a pushback and a rebuke of Erdogan because the economy is not doing great. There's been a lot of inflation lately. So I think it's a pushback by voters against Erdogan and his economic policies. The next presidential election's in 2028. It's 2024. So, as we know with United States elections, a lot can happen in 4 years. So, we'll just have to wait and see what eventually happens here. But I think at the moment, the CHP has to be feeling pretty good about themselves. So, that ends our news roundup. We now move to our conversation on the strengthening of U.S. Japan defense ties with Yuki Tatsumi, a senior fellow and co director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. She's also the director of the Japan program at Stimson. Prior to her time at the Stimson Center, Tatsumi worked as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and as the special assistant for political affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington. Let's listen in to the conversation. We're excited today to be joined by Yuki Tatsumi to talk about the big U.S. Philippines-Japan summit that took place recently. Yuki, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So to kind of set the stage here for our listeners, can you walk us through a little bit about what has been sort of the recent history of relations between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines? And are they kind of at a high point right now as we came to the summit last week?
I think so. So I think that to give you, like you mentioned, just give you a little bit of background. U.S.-Japan-Philippine relationship has kind of undergone interesting dynamics. During the Duterte administration in the Philippines, because of the nature of his leadership style and some of his domestic policies, I think U.S.-Filipino relations were a little bit on the rocky ground. And also President Duterte was a little bit more engaging with China in the issue of South China Sea related questions. That made U.S. a little bit uncomfortable in terms of, wait, you are a treaty ally and where are you going, in a nutshell. During that time, I think Japan actually kind of played a really important role, kind of making sure that the Philippines stay engaged with the U.S. and its allies and partners. Then Prime Minister Abe, who unfortunately tragically assassinated a couple of years ago, he had a very good personal relationship with President Duterte. So he really invested his time in making sure that he made President Duterte feel that Japan cares about the Philippines and Japan cares about Philippines concerns, and that really helped this trilateral relationship kind of go over that kind of a rocky period. And when President Marcos came on, although his political style is very populist, he also came out with a very strong position vis-a-vis China, and that is really, it's almost because he's populist. I think Filipino, on a public level, is really feeling the pressure from China in terms of their fishermen activities and other things where China really comes on strong to try to restrict some of the movements of the Filipino civilian ships, like commercial ships, fishing boats. So President Marcos's instinct is really hug the U.S. tighter. And then I think that was really welcoming development for U.S. and also Japan. So this U.S.-Japan Filipino triad, really for the first time, and especially it's very special because it did happen at the White House. It is really the first one amongst the three leaders. Three countries' national security advisors have met leading up to this, and then that was even, the first of its kind. So it really shows U.S.-Japan joint effort to continue to maintain its engagement with Southeast Asian countries robust. And I think Philippines is a perfect candidate because A, it is a treaty ally of the U.S., and B, it is also a country that Japan really considers as an important partner and an important country to support in terms of its ability to, defend itself, shoring up its Coast Guard capacity and so forth.
Yeah, and you mentioned China, of course, and that was the big elephant in the room throughout the summit. And the U.S.-Japan relationship has been tight for the past 75 years. Philippines kind of gone back and forth at different times. But in many ways, China, while it was at the top of the agenda, has also in some ways pushed countries like the Philippines back towards the U.S. after kind of spinning off a little bit there during the Duterte years. What are the Chinese doing? What's their relationship with the Philippines? You mentioned a couple of things with the fisheries. So what has been going on with China and the Philippines in that area? And then what is Japan's sort of worry when it comes to China as well?
So that's a great question. So, you just highlighted the excellent example of Chinese behavior that really is driving some of those, Southeast Asian countries who have been kind of on the fence for the last few years back into alliance and the partnership sphere. China has long claimed that the entire South China Sea is it's their own. A couple of decades ago, they had amended their law that governs their territorial sea. And then in the last couple of years, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, they revised it again in a way that it gave their Coast Guard an authority to quote unquote enforce their territorial claims. So basically, what that did as a result is now Chinese Coast Guard, sometimes naval ships are treating South China Sea like really it's territorial water. So it's basically blockading and harassing the fishing boat, Coast Guard ships, commercial ships, all the countries that are living in the South China Sea space. So Philippines has been getting the brunt of it for a while. Vietnam has been harassed by it for quite some time. And that really has been problematic. And Japan has been going through Chinese similar behavior in East China Sea, which is close to their territory. And the only reason why it hasn't really reached the point of what's going on right now in South China Sea is solely because of the resilience of Japan's own Coast Guard. Whenever they see something, they go out and make sure that they counter them, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, countries like Philippines and Vietnam do not have that capacity in their own Coast Guard. So that is really what the focus of Japan's support for these countries have been, to help them build their Coast Guard capacity so that they can basically replicate what Japan's Coast Guard has been doing vis-a-vis Chinese harassing, bullyish behavior. And then also try to work with Southeast Asia countries that has claims in South China Sea as a whole, as kind of a big group, so that perhaps they can coordinate and connect their maritime domain awareness system so that at least they can kind of talk to each other when they're being harassed by Beijing. So that has been the focus of Japan's support. So it's really not a military assistance, but it's more like a Coast Guard, maritime safety assistance. But it always helps to have a United States squarely signed up for these efforts. And I think last week's summit really symbolizes that U.S. recommitment that we're here to support you.
So do you see that as sort of the big takeaway for Japan and the Philippines, was sort of just to reaffirm that alliance system and the U.S. being invested in that area?
That is definitely a big part of that. And then another part is this is also a joint concern with the U.S. Allies and partners, is how to reduce their respective or collective dependence on certain strategic materials China exports. So critical mineral, supply of the critical mineral is, I think, has been a big topic of the discussion when three leaders met last week. Also, cooperation in the advanced technologies and basically support Philippines to get that capacity as well. That also was a big topic. So when U.S., Japan, and now more so Philippines look at China, their concern is no longer just their brunt physical force, whether that may be Coast Guard or military, but then it's on the other side of the equation too, that what their industrial capacity has been, and because of their system of economy. And then it's a basically big, one big military industrial complex. Scientists moves between military science and civilian science like there's no wall. And basically a military civilian fusion going on when it comes to technologies that they use. So, China has a big landmass, and it has been the critical supplier of certain very important strategic materials like rare earth materials and others. So those are kind of two sides of the concerns for U.S. allies and partners, certainly including Japan and Philippines, but more so, nowadays. I mean, I know Europe, Australia, UK, those countries also have come to realize that, oh my gosh, no, this is not good. We need to have a better balance and bring some of those, self-dependence back, or dependence amongst the friends back. So that's why I think for the last few years, we really start hearing more and more words about de-risking or friendshoring. And I think that's really, is driven by those concerns.
Yeah, and you mentioned Australia and the UK, and there was chatter last week about the potential of, in some fashion, Japan joining AUKUS, which is the Australia, UK, US alliance that came out a couple years ago, What is going on with that? And you mentioned critical minerals and the technology side of this. Is that sort of more of the role Japan would play if brought into AUKUS in like a tier two kind of thing?
So, what was decided at the end of the US Japan summit is that Japan would start what probably will be a long and difficult and complex consultation process with AUKUS for its participation in what they call Pillar 2, which is advanced technologies other than nuclear. So, Pillar 1 squarely is nuclear, and that squarely belongs to AUKUS alone. But pillar two is where August countries begin to think about winding up that cooperation in advanced technologies a little bit more up to broader U.S. allies. And Japan has been kind of at the forefront of that. The reason, and you're already seeing the EU Japan kind of prepping the way for that. That Japan recently relaxed its arms export guidelines to be able to export back some of the armaments that it has been licensed producing, and license being issued by the US. And this is kind of try to help US out in terms of sure the munitions that are in the high demands from security assistance worldwide, including Ukraine. Like quantum computing, AI, there are a couple of other areas that US Japan together identified to intensify the bilateral cooperations, but those are very much in line with the Pillar 2 focus areas for AUKUS. So what I end up happening in down the road, and I don't think this will happen in a short term because the negotiation process to work everything out amongst Japan and the AUKUS partners will be very complex. But what will end up happening is Japan will start joining in to some of those joint research efforts on some of the projects that the AUKUS manages, with the hope that Japan would eventually begins to, co-develop and co-produce some of those. And by doing so, production capacity of, certain technologies and equipment that whatever that may be come out of those research projects expands, right? I mean, it's, responsibility is not just shared by three, but then it's also shared by four countries. So I think they're looking for that win-win situation where Japan gets a benefit of being able to participate in the joint international joint R&D from the very early on, which helps their own defense industrial base. But in return, they're also helping the AUKUS countries out because when Japan participates, they also, contributes like, funds and its own industrial capacity and, so forth. So they are really looking for those kind of a win-win partnership down the road.
Yeah, at the end of the day, a stronger Japan helps AUKUS. That's what they're looking for in this. So, final question here for you, and I want to stick with Japan here because you've talked about their defense industrial base and things like that. I think it's important to remember for folks that, historically, since World War II, Japan has had pacifist principles written into their constitution, but we've seen them take steps in the last decade to sort of move away from that, mostly because of China, but also with the North Korean threat and things like that. So, where do you see that at the moment? Where is Japan with its constitution, amendments to its constitution to enable it to do more things in defense of the region and things like that?
So Japan, I think, still is kind of a worlds away from amending the constitution straight up. What they have done under the leadership of our Prime Minister Abe was to reinterpret the constitution to expand what it could do without going out a full-blown amendment, because that is a national endeavor, like a multi-year amendment needs a referendum to do this, and there are a lot of procedure wise, there are a lot of roadblocks too in between. But in the meantime, I think by reinterpreting this key clause that prohibited Japan from only doing things within its own territory and in the sole name of a self-defense of Japan, not attack on friends or attack on us too, kind of. That was not the case. So under the leadership of Prime Minister Abe, on a certain scenario, which is, very, very fluid scenario, so effectively Japan can do a lot more in terms of attack for one is attack for both, or attack for one is attack for all in sphere. And then Japan also has begun to increase its defense budget. It has begun to further revise its arms export guidelines to basically let Japan's defense industrial base to be able to compete overseas, or at least have a opportunity to have an access to wider market outside Japan, to honestly help its own health, because Japan's defense industrial base has been hollowing out for the last good 10, 15 years because of its shrinking defense budget, because it has been strictly restricted to have only Japan Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Force as its own customer. So basically, the profit is not increasing. If anything, it's decreasing. So we have seen many second tier, third tier companies that have produced some of those materials have basically exited the market. And once they exit, it's very hard for them to come back in. They have to have a really nice promise of, okay, if we go back in, now we can really make money. We can, this makes business sense for us. And then also, I think on the military to military basis, one of the hallmark about the U.S.-Japan summit last week was to modernize the two militaries' command and control system. Now, the devils are in details, and we'll see how painful, but it is a major step, because for, historically, between the two militaries, because of that, Japan's constitutional restrictions, U.S. and Japan basically have its own command and control system as a parallel structure, and at the different level, it has a connecting node. And as the nature of the threat becomes more fluid, and sometimes some of that is not even kinetic, so basically initial response is going to be critical. So that traditional model really cannot keep up with the pace of the contingencies that we are anticipating to unfold. But I think that trajectory, I don't see that significantly alter for the foreseeable future, because I'll go back to this is probably where I should have started, in Japan's national security strategy in December 2022. That is really the first time that Japan had singled out China as the most grave security concerns for the foreseeable future. It has, in the past, it has already treaded carefully between, we're concerned about China, but we still want to engage China. But this one really tilted it toward the more warning, alarming way. And I really don't think, given what China has been doing, not just in Japan's neighborhood, but then also in South China Sea, but then also, its relationship with countries like Russia, North Korea, and Iran, I really don't think that tone significantly alter in the foreseeable future. And I think it doesn't matter whether the leadership change occurs in Japan and how many.
All right, Yuki, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it, and enlightening us on what's going on in Asia right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Yuki for her time and thoughts, and thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Jarrett Dang. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.